World War II was the largest and most destructive conflict in human history, involving dozens of nations across multiple continents and causing the deaths of tens of millions of soldiers and civilians. And among all the major battles fought during the war, the Battle of Stalingrad became one of the most important turning points that would eventually lead to the defeat of Nazi Germany. By 1942, Germany had already conquered much of Europe and seemed nearly unstoppable, but the Soviet Union remained standing despite suffering massive losses in soldiers, equipment, and territory during the early stages of the war. Adolf Hitler believed destroying the Soviet Union was necessary for Germany to win the war, and this belief led to the launch of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the largest land invasion ever attempted in history. Millions of German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, capturing huge areas of land quickly and surrounding entire Soviet armies. And at first, the invasion seemed extremely successful, but the Soviet Union refused to surrender, and when winter arrived later that year, German forces were not prepared for the extreme cold, slowing their advance and giving Soviet forces time to recover, reorganize, and rebuild their military strength. In 1942, Germany shifted its focus toward capturing oil fields in the Caucasus region because modern warfare depended heavily on fuel for vehicles, aircraft, tanks, and industrial production, and without a reliable oil supply, Germany's military operations would eventually fail. To reach these oil fields safely, Germany needed to control transport routes along the Volga River, and this made the industrial city of Stalingrad a key military target. The city was also symbolically important because it was named after Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, and capturing it would be a major propaganda victory for Germany, while damaging Soviet morale and showing the world that German forces could defeat one of their most powerful enemies. During the summer of 1942, German forces advanced toward Stalingrad, and by August, they reached the city and began heavy bombing attacks designed to destroy infrastructure and weaken Soviet resistance before ground troops moved in. German aircraft dropped thousands of bombs, destroying homes, factories, railways, and power systems, killing large numbers of civilians and turning much of the city into rubble and burning ruins. However, the destruction of Stalingrad created unexpected problems for German forces because the rubble made it difficult for tanks and vehicles to move through narrow streets and destroyed roads, while giving Soviet soldiers many places to hide and defend. The battle soon turned into brutal urban warfare, where soldiers fought building by building, and sometimes room by room, and combat took place inside destroyed factories, apartment buildings, basements, and even sewer tunnels beneath the city. Soldiers often fought at extremely close distances, using grenades, rifles, machine guns, and sometimes even knives, and casualties were extremely high on both sides. Snipers became especially important in this environment because they could control open streets and target officers or machine gun crews, and one of the most famous Soviet snipers, Vasily Zaitsev, became known for his accuracy and was used as a symbol of Soviet resistance and determination during the battle. As the battle continued into late 1942, Soviet commanders decided that Stalingrad had to be defended at any cost, because losing the city would give Germany control over major transport routes and threaten the southern parts of the Soviet Union, and soldiers were ordered to hold their positions no matter how difficult the conditions became. Reinforcements were sent across the Volga River, often at night, using small boats, while German aircraft and artillery constantly attacked the river crossings, and many soldiers died before they even reached the city. But new troops kept arriving because Soviet leadership believed the defense of Stalingrad was critical for the survival of the country. Civilians who remained inside the city were forced to survive in basements, destroyed buildings, and underground shelters, dealing with hunger, disease, freezing temperatures, and constant bombardment. And many families were separated forever during evacuation attempts or sudden air attacks that destroyed entire streets in seconds. By autumn 1942, German forces controlled large parts of Stalingrad, including important factories and industrial zones, but their supply lines were stretched thin because the front lines had moved far from their original bases, and their flanks were guarded by weaker Axis Allied forces, including Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units, which were less equipped and less experienced than the main German army units. Soviet commanders recognized this weakness and began planning a massive counteroffensive designed to trap German forces inside the city instead of fighting them directly in urban combat. In November 1942, the Soviet Union launched Operation Uranus, a large-scale attack targeting the weaker Axis forces guarding the German flanks, and Soviet armored and infantry units broke through enemy defenses and advanced quickly across open terrain, eventually surrounding the German Sixth Army and trapping more than 250,000 Axis troops inside Stalingrad. The encirclement shocked German commanders, but Adolf Hitler refused to allow the trapped army to retreat, instead ordering them to hold their positions and promising that supplies would be delivered by air until reinforcements could arrive. But this plan quickly failed because the German Air Force did not have enough transport aircraft to deliver the massive amount of food, ammunition, and medical supplies needed to support such a large force. Winter weather made flying extremely dangerous, with snowstorms, freezing temperatures, and Soviet anti-aircraft fire causing heavy losses to German supply aircraft. Inside Stalingrad, German soldiers began suffering from severe food shortages, and daily rations dropped lower and lower, and medical supplies ran out, leaving wounded soldiers without treatment. As temperatures dropped far below freezing, many soldiers suffered from frostbite, hypothermia, and illness, especially because many were not equipped with proper winter clothing, and starvation and disease began killing soldiers almost as effectively as enemy weapons. By December 1942, the situation inside Stalingrad had become extremely desperate for the trapped German forces, as food supplies continued to shrink and ammunition became harder to replace, and many soldiers were forced to survive on very small rations that were not enough to maintain strength or health. Horses that were once used for transport were slaughtered for food, and some soldiers survived on frozen scraps of bread or soup made from whatever materials could be found. Medical conditions inside the encircled city became terrible because hospitals were overcrowded, medicines were running out, and wounded soldiers often died from infections or untreated injuries. At the same time, Soviet forces continued tightening the encirclement, slowly pushing inward and attacking German defensive positions from multiple directions, using artillery, tanks, and infantry working together. German commanders hoped that a relief force could break through Soviet lines and rescue the trapped Sixth Army, and a rescue attempt was launched from outside the city. But Soviet defenses were strong and well organized, and the rescue operation failed to reach the surrounded forces. As weeks passed, morale inside the German army continued to collapse because soldiers understood that help might never arrive, and many soldiers were physically and mentally exhausted from constant fighting, freezing weather, and starvation. Letters from soldiers described hopeless conditions, with some soldiers writing farewell messages to their families because they believed they would never leave the city alive. By January 1943, Soviet forces launched final attacks designed to completely destroy the remaining German resistance inside Stalingrad, and German defensive positions were divided into smaller and smaller pockets as Soviet troops captured streets, factories, and defensive strongpoints one by one. Communication between German units became difficult, and supplies were almost completely gone. Many soldiers could barely stand due to hunger and illness, and ammunition shortages meant that some units could not properly defend themselves during Soviet attacks. Despite these conditions, orders from German leadership continued to demand resistance, even when defeat was clearly unavoidable. Eventually, on February 2, 1943, the remaining German forces in Stalingrad surrendered, marking one of the most important turning points of World War II because it was the first time a major German army formation had been completely destroyed and forced to surrender to enemy forces. The loss shocked Germany and its allies, and it also greatly increased confidence among Allied nations because it showed that Nazi Germany could be defeated in a large-scale land battle. For the Soviet Union, the victory came at an enormous cost, but it proved that their military and industry were capable of defeating one of the strongest armies in the world. After the surrender at Stalingrad, the balance of power on the Eastern Front began to shift permanently in favor of the Soviet Union, and German forces were forced into a defensive position that they would never fully recover from for the rest of the war. The loss of the Sixth Army was not only a military disaster, but also a psychological blow to Germany, because until Stalingrad, many people believed the German army was nearly unstoppable. News of the defeat spread across Europe and the world, giving hope to Allied nations and resistance movements that had been fighting against German control. At the same time, the victory boosted Soviet morale and strengthened their determination to push westward and drive German forces out of Soviet territory. The battle also demonstrated the importance of logistics and supply lines in modern warfare, because even highly trained and well-equipped armies cannot survive without reliable food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. German forces inside Stalingrad were cut off from these resources, and as a result, their combat effectiveness slowly collapsed over time. The battle showed military planners around the world that controlling supply routes and protecting flanks can be just as important as winning direct combat engagements. Weather also played a major role because the extreme winter conditions made it difficult for German forces to operate and made air supply nearly impossible, while Soviet forces were more prepared to fight in those conditions. For civilians, the battle left Stalingrad almost completely destroyed, with large parts of the city reduced to rubble and thousands of buildings damaged beyond repair. Many survivors returned after the battle to find their homes gone and their families missing. Rebuilding the city took many years, and the psychological effects of the battle lasted for generations. Memorials and monuments were later built to honor the soldiers and civilians who died defending the city, and Stalingrad became a symbol of sacrifice and national resistance within the Soviet Union. The legacy of Stalingrad continued long after the war ended, because military historians studied the battle to understand how strategy, morale, leadership, weather, and supply systems can influence the outcome of major conflicts. The battle is still taught in military academies as an example of both strategic mistakes and strategic success. It also became a reminder of how destructive total war can be, where entire cities and civilian populations become part of the battlefield. Even decades later, the story of Stalingrad continues to be told through books, documentaries, museums, and survivor accounts, ensuring that the sacrifices made during the battle are never forgotten. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad marked the beginning of a long series of offensives that would slowly push German forces back across Eastern Europe. And after the battle, the Soviet army began preparing for larger operations designed to destroy German defensive positions and reclaim lost territory. Over the next 2 years, Soviet forces launched multiple major offensives, using lessons learned from Stalingrad about coordination between infantry, tanks, artillery, and air power. The Red Army also improved its logistics systems, making sure troops had better supplies, equipment, and communication support, which helped them maintain momentum during long campaigns. German forces, on the other hand, were forced to fight defensive battles while dealing with supply shortages, fuel problems, and constant pressure from Soviet advances. The battle also changed how soldiers and civilians viewed the war, because Stalingrad proved that even the strongest military forces could be defeated if they were stretched too far and lost control of their supply lines. Many German soldiers who survived the battle described it as one of the most terrifying experiences of their lives, with constant artillery fire, extreme cold, and severe hunger breaking down morale. Soviet soldiers also suffered greatly, facing high casualty rates and harsh conditions, but the victory gave them confidence that they could defeat Germany if they continued fighting together. Stalingrad also influenced global politics, because Allied leaders saw the Soviet Union as a much stronger partner after the victory, and cooperation between Allied nations increased as they began planning future operations against Germany. The battle helped convince many neutral countries that Germany might lose the war, which influenced diplomatic relationships and international support. At the same time, the propaganda value of the victory helped strengthen Soviet unity and increased public support for continuing the war effort despite heavy losses. Today, the Battle of Stalingrad is remembered as one of the most important examples of total war, where entire cities, industries, and populations were drawn into a single massive conflict. The battle showed how modern warfare can destroy entire urban areas and cause massive civilian suffering. Museums, memorials, and historical research continue to preserve the memory of those who fought and died there. The story of Stalingrad remains important not only because of its military impact, but also because it reminds humanity of the cost of large-scale war and the importance of preventing such destruction in the future. After Stalingrad, the momentum of the war on the Eastern Front shifted heavily toward the Soviet Union, and German commanders were forced to rethink their strategies as they faced an enemy that was becoming stronger, more organized, and better equipped with each passing month. Soviet factories, many of which had been moved far east earlier in the war, were now producing massive amounts of tanks, aircraft, artillery, and ammunition, allowing Soviet forces to replace losses faster than Germany could. The Red Army also improved its training programs, creating soldiers who were better prepared for large-scale coordinated offensives, and this allowed Soviet commanders to plan operations that used multiple branches of the military working together at the same time. Meanwhile, German forces struggled to replace lost equipment and experienced soldiers because their industry was under constant pressure from Allied bombing campaigns, and resources such as fuel and raw materials were becoming harder to obtain. German soldiers on the Eastern Front were often forced to fight with limited supplies, and many units were moved quickly from one defensive position to another, trying to slow Soviet advances. The psychological impact of Stalingrad also affected German troops, because many soldiers lost confidence in the idea that victory was guaranteed, and fear of being surrounded like the Sixth Army became a constant concern during later battles. For Soviet soldiers, the victory at Stalingrad became a symbol of what determination and sacrifice could achieve, and many units used the memory of the battle as motivation during later offensives. Soviet propaganda highlighted stories of heroism from Stalingrad, showing soldiers and civilians who refused to surrender despite overwhelming odds, and these stories helped maintain morale during the difficult years that followed. The battle also helped strengthen Soviet national identity, because it showed that the country could survive and defeat a powerful invading force. In the years after the war, historians and military experts studied Stalingrad in great detail, examining how decisions made by leaders on both sides influenced the outcome. The battle became an example of how overconfidence, poor supply planning, and underestimating an enemy can lead to disaster, while strong coordination, resilience, and strategic planning can lead to victory even in extremely difficult conditions. Today, Stalingrad is remembered not only as a military turning point, but also as a reminder of the human cost of war and the importance of learning from history to prevent future global conflicts. The human cost of the Battle of Stalingrad was enormous, and even decades later, historians continue to study the personal experiences of soldiers and civilians who lived through the battle to understand the true scale of suffering that took place. Many soldiers on both sides faced constant fear, exhaustion, and emotional trauma from months of nonstop fighting, and surviving soldiers often carried these psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Civilians who survived the destruction of the city often returned after the battle to find entire neighborhoods gone, with homes, schools, and hospitals reduced to rubble, and many families never found out what happened to relatives who disappeared during the fighting. The battle also demonstrated how modern warfare affects not only soldiers, but entire populations, because cities like Stalingrad became battlefields where civilians were trapped in the middle of military operations. Food shortages became common, clean water was difficult to find, and medical care was extremely limited, and many civilians survived only because they found shelter in underground areas or shared limited resources with neighbors and soldiers. These experiences showed the world how total war could destroy not only armies, but entire societies and communities. After the war ended, the Soviet Union rebuilt Stalingrad, and the city became a symbol of resistance and victory. Monuments and memorials were built to honor those who died defending the city, and ceremonies were held each year to remember the sacrifice of soldiers and civilians. One of the most famous memorials built after the war became a powerful symbol of remembrance, representing the courage and determination of those who fought there. These memorials were designed not only to honor the dead, but also to remind future generations of the importance of peace and the dangers of global conflict. The Battle of Stalingrad also influenced how future wars were studied and understood, because military planners realized that controlling supply routes, protecting flanks, and preparing for extreme weather conditions could determine the success or failure of an entire campaign. The battle showed how leadership decisions at the highest level could affect the survival of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and it became an example of how strategy, morale, logistics, and environment all combined to shape the outcome of war. Today, Stalingrad remains one of the most studied battles in military history because of the lessons it provides about modern warfare and human resilience. The global reaction to the Soviet victory at Stalingrad was significant because it changed how many countries viewed the future of the war, and leaders in Allied nations began to see the Soviet Union as a force capable of defeating Germany on land. This increased cooperation between Allied countries as they began planning coordinated strategies to defeat Germany from multiple directions. At the same time, resistance movements in German-occupied countries gained hope because Stalingrad showed that German forces could be defeated in a major battle. News of the German defeat spread quickly, and it weakened the image of German military invincibility that had existed earlier in the war. The battle also changed how military leaders around the world thought about urban warfare, because Stalingrad demonstrated how difficult it is to capture and hold a large city when defenders are determined and familiar with the terrain. Later military strategies began to place greater importance on avoiding prolonged urban combat when possible, because fighting in cities often leads to extremely high casualties and slow progress. The battle showed that even a heavily bombed city can still be defended effectively if defenders are willing to fight from ruins and use every available structure as protection. In addition to military lessons, Stalingrad also influenced political and cultural memory, especially in the Soviet Union and later in Russia, where the battle became part of national identity and historical pride. Stories from the battle were included in books, films, and education programs, and survivors shared their experiences with future generations. The battle became a symbol of sacrifice and unity, showing how a population can come together to defend their country during extreme crisis. These cultural memories helped shape how future generations understood World War II and the role Stalingrad played in it. Today, historians continue to research Stalingrad using historical documents, photographs, personal diaries, and battlefield analysis, trying to understand exactly how the battle unfolded and how different decisions changed the outcome. The battle remains important not only because of its historical significance, but also because it serves as a reminder of the destructive power of modern warfare and the importance of preventing future global conflicts. The story of Stalingrad continues to be told around the world as both a warning and a lesson about the consequences of total war. Another important result of the Battle of Stalingrad was how it influenced the morale of soldiers and civilians across Europe, because before the battle many people believed Germany would eventually win the war due to its early victories, but after Stalingrad that belief began to weaken. Soldiers fighting against Germany in other parts of Europe and North Africa saw the battle as proof that German forces could be defeated if they were pushed hard enough. This psychological shift played a major role in strengthening resistance movements and encouraging Allied nations to continue fighting despite heavy losses in earlier years of the war. The battle also forced German military leadership to make difficult strategic decisions about how to continue the war, because losing such a large army meant that Germany had fewer experienced soldiers available for future battles. Germany attempted to rebuild its forces, but replacing trained soldiers, officers, and equipment was extremely difficult, especially while fighting on multiple fronts. At the same time, Allied bombing campaigns were damaging German factories and supply networks, making it harder for Germany to produce the weapons and equipment needed to replace losses from battles like Stalingrad. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Stalingrad became a major source of national pride and motivation, and it strengthened public support for continuing the war until Germany was completely defeated. Soviet propaganda used stories from Stalingrad to show examples of bravery, sacrifice, and determination, and these stories helped keep morale high, even during later battles that were still costly and dangerous. The victory also helped convince Soviet citizens that their sacrifices were helping to protect their country and push back the invasion. In the decades after the war, Stalingrad continued to be studied by historians and military experts because of the many lessons it provided about modern warfare, leadership, and human endurance. The battle showed how important it is to maintain strong supply lines, adapt to changing battlefield conditions, and avoid underestimating an enemy. It also showed how morale and determination can influence the outcome of a battle just as much as weapons and technology. Today, Stalingrad remains one of the most studied battles in history and continues to be remembered as a powerful example of the cost and consequences of total war. The Battle of Stalingrad also changed how future military leaders planned large-scale operations because it showed how dangerous it can be to advance too far without properly protecting supply routes and flanks. And many military academies around the world later studied the battle as an example of how quickly a strong army can collapse if it becomes surrounded and cut off from resources. The German Sixth Army entered Stalingrad as one of Germany's most powerful and experienced forces, but once it was surrounded and unable to receive enough supplies, its ability to fight slowly disappeared. This demonstrated that even the strongest army cannot survive without food, ammunition, medical supplies, and communication support. Another important lesson from Stalingrad was the role of weather and environment in warfare, because the extreme winter conditions made it much harder for German forces to operate effectively, while Soviet forces were more prepared to fight in cold weather. Snow, ice, and freezing temperatures made it difficult for vehicles to move, and made it dangerous for aircraft to fly supply missions. Soldiers who were not properly equipped suffered from frostbite and illness, and this reduced combat effectiveness. Modern military planners later recognized the importance of preparing for environmental conditions before launching major operations. The battle also showed how important leadership decisions can be during wartime, because orders given by leaders far from the battlefield can affect the survival of thousands of soldiers. In Stalingrad, the decision to continue fighting instead of retreating led to the complete destruction of an entire army. This example is still studied as a warning about the dangers of refusing to change strategy when conditions change. Military leaders today often study Stalingrad to understand how communication, flexibility, and realistic planning can help prevent similar disasters. Even today, the story of Stalingrad continues to be told through history books, documentaries, museums, and memorial sites, and many people visit the former battlefield to learn about what happened there. The battle is remembered not only as a military turning point, but also as a reminder of the human cost of war. The destruction of Stalingrad showed how entire cities can be destroyed and how civilians can suffer greatly during total war. Remembering these events helps future generations understand why preventing global conflict is so important. As historians continued to study the Battle of Stalingrad over the years, they began to better understand how complex the battle really was, because it was not decided by one single event, but by a combination of strategy, logistics, leadership decisions, weather conditions, and the determination of the soldiers and civilians involved. The battle showed how modern warfare is influenced by many different factors at the same time, and how a failure in one area, such as supply planning or communication, can lead to collapse even if an army is strong in other areas. These lessons have been used by military planners around the world to improve how large military operations are organized and executed. The battle also became an important subject in education because it helped students and historians understand how World War II developed and why it eventually ended the way it did. By studying Stalingrad, people can see how early German successes led to overconfidence, and how the Soviet Union adapted and improved its military strength over time. The battle also showed how industrial production, transportation systems, and civilian support can influence the outcome of war just as much as soldiers and weapons. The Soviet Union was able to continue producing tanks, aircraft, and ammunition despite losing large areas of territory, and this played a major role in their eventual victory. For survivors of the battle, Stalingrad remained a powerful and emotional memory for the rest of their lives because many had lost friends, family members, and homes during the fighting. Some survivors later shared their stories through interviews, books, and documentaries, helping future generations understand what it was like to live through such a massive and destructive battle. These personal stories help historians understand the human side of war, beyond statistics and military reports. Today, Stalingrad remains one of the most important examples of how total war can affect entire populations, not just armies. The battle showed how civilians can become part of the battlefield and how cities can be destroyed during large conflicts. By remembering the Battle of Stalingrad and studying its lessons, societies around the world can better understand the dangers of large-scale war and the importance of working toward peace and stability in the future. The rebuilding of Stalingrad after the war became a powerful symbol of recovery and determination, because the city had been almost completely destroyed during months of intense fighting, and rebuilding it required years of effort, resources, and labor. Many survivors returned to the city and helped rebuild homes, factories, schools, and hospitals, slowly turning the ruins back into a functioning city. The rebuilding process also became a symbol of national pride because it showed that even after massive destruction, a country could recover and rebuild stronger than before. The city was eventually renamed Volgograd, but its connection to the Battle of Stalingrad remains an important part of its identity and history. The battle also influenced how future generations remembered World War II, especially in the Soviet Union, where Stalingrad became a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and national unity. Schools taught students about the battle as an example of how determination and cooperation can help a country survive even the most difficult challenges. Films, books, and art often told stories about soldiers and civilians who fought or lived through the battle, helping keep the memory of the event alive. These cultural memories helped shape how people understood the war and the sacrifices that were made to win it. Internationally, Stalingrad became recognized as one of the most important battles of the 20th century, and historians from many countries studied it to understand how such a large and complex battle unfolded. Military experts studied the strategies used by both sides, examining what worked and what failed. The battle helped shape modern military theory, especially in areas such as urban combat, supply chain management, and large-scale coordination between different branches of the military. These lessons continue to influence how modern armies prepare for potential conflicts. The Battle of Stalingrad remains a reminder of how destructive war can be when it reaches a global scale, and it shows how quickly entire cities and populations can be drawn into violent conflict. By remembering the battle and studying its lessons, historians and educators hope to help future generations understand the importance of preventing large-scale war and working toward peaceful solutions to international problems. The story of Stalingrad continues to be told as both a historical lesson and a warning about the dangers of global conflict. The memory of the Battle of Stalingrad also played a major role in shaping how World War II was remembered in the decades that followed, especially in countries that were directly affected by the war. For many people, Stalingrad represented the moment when the war began to turn against Nazi Germany, and it became a symbol of how determination and sacrifice could change the outcome of a global conflict. Veterans who survived the battle often described it as one of the most intense and terrifying experiences of their lives, with constant explosions, collapsing buildings, and freezing weather creating conditions that were almost impossible to survive for long periods of time. These personal memories helped future generations understand that war is not only about strategy and victory, but also about survival and loss. The battle also influenced how cities prepare for emergencies and disasters because Stalingrad showed how quickly infrastructure such as power, water, transportation, and medical services can collapse during major conflicts. Governments around the world later studied how cities could be better protected and how emergency services could be organized to respond to large-scale destruction. The battle became an example of how important it is to protect civilians and maintain basic services even during times of conflict or crisis. In addition, Stalingrad became an important example in discussions about leadership and decision-making during war, because it showed how decisions made far from the battlefield can affect the lives of thousands of soldiers. Military leaders today study Stalingrad to understand the importance of flexibility, communication, and realistic planning. The battle demonstrated how refusing to change strategy when conditions change can lead to disaster, while adapting quickly to new situations can improve chances of survival and success. Today, Stalingrad remains one of the most well-known battles in world history, and it continues to be studied in schools, universities, and military academies. The battle is remembered not only because of its military importance, but also because of the human stories connected to it. The experiences of soldiers and civilians who lived through the battle continue to remind the world of the cost of war and the importance of working toward peace and stability whenever possible. The Battle of Stalingrad also became an important turning point in how the world understood the scale and brutality of modern industrial warfare, because it showed how entire cities could become battlefields where civilians and soldiers faced the same dangers. Before Stalingrad, many battles in World War II had involved large open areas of land, But Stalingrad demonstrated how destructive and difficult urban combat could be. Fighting in a dense city environment meant that every building could become a defensive position and every street could become a deadly combat zone. This forced military planners around the world to rethink how armies should approach urban warfare in the future, leading to new training methods and strategies designed to reduce casualties and increase effectiveness in city combat. The battle also highlighted the importance of industrial production during wartime, because the Soviet Union was able to continue producing tanks, weapons, and ammunition, despite losing large parts of its territory earlier in the war. Many Soviet factories had been moved east before German forces could capture them, and this allowed the Soviet Union to continue supplying its army during critical moments like the Battle of Stalingrad. This demonstrated how economic strength and industrial planning can be just as important as battlefield tactics during a long war. Modern military strategists continue to study this aspect of the battle to understand how supply chains and industrial capacity influence long-term military success. The story of Stalingrad also influenced how World War II was remembered in popular culture, because the battle became the subject of books, films, and documentaries that tried to show what life was like for soldiers and civilians during the fighting. Many of these stories focused on personal experiences, showing how individuals survived under extreme conditions and how communities supported each other during times of crisis. These cultural portrayals helped keep the memory of the battle alive and helped people understand the human side of history, not just the military events. Even today, the former battlefield areas continue to be places of remembrance, where memorials and museums honor those who fought and died during the battle. Visitors from around the world travel to learn about what happened there and to pay respect to the millions of people affected by the battle. The memory of Stalingrad continues to serve as a reminder of the destructive power of war and the importance of preventing similar conflicts in the future. The Battle of Stalingrad also changed how nations prepared their populations for total war, because it showed that modern conflicts could involve not only soldiers, but entire societies, and governments realized that civilian industries, transportation networks, and food production systems all had to be prepared to support long wars. During World War II, both Germany and the Soviet Union mobilized large parts of their populations to work in factories, produce equipment, and support the military. But Stalingrad showed how important it was to protect these systems from destruction. Modern governments later used these lessons when planning civil defense systems and emergency response strategies for large-scale crises. The battle also became an example of how quickly war can change the lives of ordinary people, because many civilians in Stalingrad had been living normal lives before the city became a battlefield. Families were suddenly forced to hide in basements, survive with limited food, and live under constant fear of bombs and artillery. These experiences became powerful reminders of how war affects people far beyond the battlefield. Personal stories from survivors helped historians and future generations understand the emotional and psychological effects of war, not just the physical destruction. Another lasting impact of Stalingrad was how it influenced international military cooperation, because Allied nations began sharing more intelligence, technology, and strategic planning after seeing how important coordination was in defeating a powerful enemy. The battle showed that large-scale conflicts require cooperation between multiple countries, especially when facing a well-equipped opponent. This lesson later influenced how alliances were formed during the Cold War and beyond, as countries realized the importance of working together for defense and security. Today, the Battle of Stalingrad remains one of the most studied and remembered battles in history, not only because of its military importance, but also because of its human impact. The battle continues to be used as an example of how courage, determination, and sacrifice can influence the outcome of major historical events. At the same time, it serves as a warning about the destruction and suffering that war can bring, reminding people around the world of the importance of peace, diplomacy, and international cooperation.